Hello, how are you doing? Good to see you. I'm doing well, We're doing good. Anything new happening with you? Oh, we had a luncheon this past Sunday. How'd that go? It was great seeing the pictures on Facebook and seeing everyone.
I gotta get them
Good
together.
morning, everybody. Let's find a seat so we can get started. Live stream people.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you for the encouragement. Thank you.
All right, so when I picked out this song for this week, I called Louise to tell her, and she said, well, then everybody's going to have to stand for this one because it's standing on the promise. So, Louise says, everybody stand for this song if you're able. If you're able. Standing on the promises of Christ my King, through eternal ages let His praises ring. Glory in the highest, I will shout and sing, standing on the promises of God. Standing, standing on the promises of God, my Savior. I'm standing on the promises of God, standing on the promises that cannot fail. When the howling storms of doubt and fear assail, by the living word of God I shall prevail. Standing on the promises of God, let me hear you. Standing, standing on the promises of God, my Savior. I'm standing on the promises of God, standing on the promises I cannot fall, listening every moment to the Spirit's call, resting in my Savior as my all in all, standing on the promises of God, standing on the promises of God, my Savior, standing. I'm standing on the promises of God. All right. Good job, everybody. Thank you, Louise. Thank you. So somebody told me when they walked in, they said, you look like a country bumpkin today. So I said, well, I'm getting ready for my character in the play, and that's all I'm going to say.
I was thinking for a scarecrow.
All right. So this question is one of those that you're not going to know, but a good guess could always win a prize. Okay. So because of the song, if you say "oh boy" one more time, because of the whole standing theme, I picked a standing question. So the longest recorded person standing on one foot was made in May of 1997 in Sri Lanka. Did I say that correctly? Sri Lanka?
Sure. That sounded good.
Sure.
So your guess is how long that was. Did the person stand on one foot? One. Sri Lanka. I will tell you that it's more than 2 days.
2 days? We have to get down to the hour. What an idiot.
Go to the hours. Guess the hours.
Hours.
Did he have 2 feet?
That's not
Did
more
they
than
ever
2
go to the
days.
bathroom?
But that's a good guess, but it's not more than 2 days. Kathy?
51.
51? Okay. Glenda?
62.
62. Karen?
30 hours.
Again, longer than 2 days, which is 48 hours. But
Oh,
that's
I'm
okay.
sorry.
That's
I was
okay.
thinking 24.
You and Brenda went to the same school, growing
Whoops.
long.
58.
58.
I'm a ditz.
Huh?
4 days, 5 days.
Oh, I gotta go by hours.
Hours?
Carol,
95.
okay.
65
D.
before.
I'm gonna say
Do I get another guess?
35.
Okay. Marie? Huh?
72.
Okay, Marie's the closest. It was 76 hours and 40 minutes on 1 foot. And you get candy today. All right.
Wow.
All right. Are we ready, Miss Donna? Oh, here we go. Talk right into that microphone. You gotta lower it. Yeah.
I still haven't gotten it.
Donna, hey y'all. Donna's gonna try to do the jokes on 1 foot. Go ahead, Donna.
Oh, no. Don't want to do that. That would be a good joke. A blonde female brought herself a new Mercedes. She could drive the car during the day, but at night the car wouldn't move at all. She tried driving the car at night for a week with no luck. Furious, she called the dealership, told them the problem, and they sent a mechanic to the house. The mechanic gave the car a thorough inspection and could not find anything wrong. Eventually, he asked the blonde, "Are you sure you're using the right gears?" "Of course I am. I'm not stupid. I use D during the day and N at night." It was my first night caring for an elderly person. When he grew sleepy, I wheeled his chair as close to the bed as I possibly could, and using the techniques I learned in school, I grasped him in a bear hug to lift him onto the bed. But I couldn't clear the top of the mattress, so I grabbed him again, summoned all my might, and hoisted him onto the bed. When the night shift nurse arrived, I recounted what had happened. "Funny," she said, looking puzzled. "Usually I just ask him to get in the bed and he does it." These are just some little short, supposed to be real things that people said that are ridiculous, but you know how people are. This is about actual statements that were found on an insurance form when they got in a car accident. It says, "Coming home, I drove into the wrong house and collided with a tree I don't have. The other car collided with mine without giving me any warning. I thought my window was down, but I found out it was up when I put my head through it.
Oh.
I collided with a stationary truck coming the other way. The truck backed through my windshield into my wife's face.
Gracious.
The guy, these are true statements people said. The guy was all over the road. I had to swerve a number of times before I hit him. I pulled away from the side of the road, glanced at my mother-in-law, and headed over the embankment. In my attempt to kill a fly, I drove into the telephone pole. To avoid hitting the bumper on the car in front, I struck the pedestrian. My car was legally parked as it backed into the other vehicle. An invisible car came out of nowhere, struck my car, and vanished. I told the police I was not injured, but on removing my hat, found that I had a fractured skull. The pedestrian had no idea what direction to run, so I ran over him. Believe it or not, these are true statements. Okay. Someday we'll forget the hurt, the reason we cried, and who caused us pain. We will finally realize that the secret of being free is not revenge, but letting things unfold in their own way and in their own time. After all, what matters is not the first, but the last chapter of our life, which shows how well we ran the race. So smile, laugh, forgive, and believe, and love all over again.
Good morning. My name is Christopher. You're a new part-time minister for a while. You know, I have to laugh to make sure we keep things on the right level when it comes to dealing with stuff that we deal with in life or even as a church. And I'm sure you've heard word about where things are for us financially recently. So, you know, whenever you're in a situation, just like with your own personal finances in your home, and you're like, okay, well, this is what's coming in, and this is what's going out, and these things aren't matching, so the only thing we can control right now is not necessarily all that's coming in, but what's going out. And so in an effort to do that with wisdom and good stewardship, we are doing this, I guess, adjustment, both to missions and with staff. I volunteered to do this, to go part-time, and, you know, it's a crazy time for anybody to do that or to have to go through that, but we serve a God who's faithful, and we just sang a song called Standing on Promises, and so I believe that this is temporary. Otherwise, I don't know if I'd volunteer for that permanently. I don't know how long. I really don't. This is all about God and His timing on things, and I trust that that God is doing something with this. That we're going through this not because of unfaithfulness, but because of God wanting us to become more faithful. And so it's a challenge, but I also think of it as an opportunity for us. And as a church, I can tell you, I think it was mentioned in the email that went out, we are growing in terms of people showing up and in baptisms and in transfers to membership and such like that. So those are good signs of going in the right direction as a church. Whatever happens typically, and this is coming from people who have seen more than I have as far as finances and church across the country, what typically happens is what you see happening in the economy around a church doesn't affect the church itself until at least 6 months or so later. And so obviously you can see the world around us is going through very similar struggles with recession potentially, but definitely with inflation and all those things. Even before that, though, all of the upheaval of the pandemic, it took a while to catch up to us, but it certainly did catch up to us financially. So those are things that we're just dealing with, but we're looking to them, I'm looking to them as an opportunity to see where God is showing up. And I can tell you over and over again, I'm seeing God show up with precise timing. And so I have story after story to talk about with that, and eventually, hopefully, I'll have opportunity to share some of those stories. But God is good, and He's continuing to be good, and so I'm not worried. You know, there's general anxiety that comes from stuff like bills and things like that, but those are things that I think on the level of concern, I'd be much more concerned if our church wasn't healthy in another way, as opposed to this. So that's all I really wanted to say about that. Of course, if you have questions or you're not really even sure what's going on, you don't have a chance to see the email or any of those things, let us know. And then your elders are available to you to answer questions, and I'm certainly happy to answer some questions, but I want to make sure I defer the right questions to the leadership as a body, as a group of elders. And so they've taken that role, and I honor them for that, and I want to continue to do that in the way that I respond to things that may come my way, that they be better answered by those guys. So if you have those types of questions, let me know, or you can certainly approach any of the elders or email elders@avalonchurch.com to find out more about what's happening next. Game plan is both Steve and myself will be part-time officially in the middle of November. So I think November 13th is the beginning of the pay period where we'll start half-time. from what we normally do. We're not anticipating that affecting what we're doing here on Wednesdays at all. I will generally spend a day in the office in the week. Wednesday will be that day. We do this, we do staff meetings. I meet with folks as I can. And then Tuesdays, I try to not necessarily be in the office unless I need to be here to meet with folks, because I do much better in writing sermons and prepping and stuff like that if I'm in a different environment than halogen lighting offsetting, office settings, you know. So I just want to continue to try to do that. So Tuesdays and Wednesdays generally is when I'm thinking specifically about what's happening here. I know Steve is most likely going to be here all the day on Wednesdays. We haven't really coordinated schedule stuff yet, because this is just a really quick, abrupt change that we've had to do. So we're dealing with that, but we're looking forward to what God's going to come through with. And like I said, He's already coming through in many ways. In fact, just last week, I hadn't even told staff about this, we got a check for $25,000 from someone, which would not have happened in the timing that it did if some other things didn't happen beforehand, knowing about this person's situation. So I didn't know if they wanted that to be a public who the person was, but that was a contribution that was given just last week as a result of their ability to be able to give at that precise time. The timing of that is just impeccable, and God's been good that way as well. I was just sharing with Linda earlier. She was contributing some shoes to my wife, and it's not because poor preacher can't afford the shoes. This is because Linda had a lot of shoes, and she was able to give some of her most prized and loved. I told her it was just like her letting go of a pet, because like there was a set of shoes that she was like, these are precious to me, but she couldn't fit in them. So she reached out to, she thought of Crystal, and Crystal was excited. Like, she showed me a picture of those shoes and all this stuff. So,
Linda, what size? What size, Linda?
Oh, that's
boots 8.
yeah, so size 8.
I wear.
Okay.
What do you call
All of a sudden, we're gonna have all these shoes coming in, but no. But so I was talking to Linda as we were doing the shoe exchange outside. It was kind of interesting. That
Quick, take them.
yeah, she had mentioned that her sister was in town Sunday.
My daughter.
I'm sorry, daughter in town from Alexandria. Alexandria, right?
Alexandria. She's Alexandria.
I remembered the place she was from.
I know. That's okay.
So daughter was in town, and she wanted me to have opportunity to meet her and her to meet me as well. Of course, I wasn't here Sunday, which is interesting because you have this email that goes out, and then I'm not there the next Sunday. It's like, is Chris okay? And things like that. I totally understand how people would feel that way, but this was actually, that time away was planned a while ago. Last month, I asked the elders for this past Sunday off to do what's called an Emmaus walk, which is kind of like a discipling type of walk thing that I was invited to do with Tim Mallory. So we had already had that on the books, and then my wife's surgery was scheduled, interrupting that this past week. And so for me to have had that Sunday off was a godsend, and I thought I was taking it for a different reason than what it was actually needed to be taken for. So timing is just beautiful with that. And so then the response from the church and encouraging Crystal, and then we have this meal train where we're eating some of the best food that's ever been fixed, and some generosity that's come from so many people. The timing is beautiful. And so I don't think I would have experienced that in the way that I have had I not been looking for, okay, God, this is something obviously that you don't anticipate, you worry about, you want to stress about, but where else can I look and see that there's goodness? And that's what I'm seeing. And it's coming from y'all, obviously. So thank you very much for your thoughtfulness, and continue to just pray for us as a church, and for Steve and myself as well, that we can make the right adjustment such as we go from here. Okay?
Okay.
That's my preamble. Let's get into the lesson. And so we are in the final week of Esther, this book, and so next week we're going to start into this one on Elijah. And so check that out. If you have an opportunity to purchase the book, it'll be worth your while. A lot of the content obviously is coming directly from the book, so this will give you a chance, like if you miss a week or whatever, to kind of keep up with what's happening, or just follow along. A lot of folks, like I said before, use the book actually as a way to get to the scripture references, because I'm not able to print all the scripture references for you in the notes and keep it all on one page. So that's an easy, handy way to kind of follow along as we're going through the chapter together. So we're in the final chapter of Esther today, and I talked last time we got together. I keep wanting to say last week, but it's been a couple weeks because of surgery. But the last time we were together, I talked about how it seemed like Esther should have ended in chapter 8 because, you know, kind of the bad guy was eliminated, and they figured out, like, we don't necessarily have to enact this law that we had before. We have another law that can go over that. And it seemed like that should be the end of it. But there was more to be said about the story because of the way that the Jews chose to not retaliate in kind for the threat that was given to them. And so the picture of grace that they showed was something we talked about last time. And now we get to see how they live happily ever after, if you will. So there have been some dark times in Esther, but even in the midst of dark times, Esther and Mordecai were willing to be used by God, and things changed. Boy, what a great encouragement for someone like myself who, like, when you look at this, you think, well, man, these must be some dark times we're going through as a church. And I feel like these are probably some of the best opportune times that we have as a church to continue to grow and take care of one another. And we see this example happening in Esther's story as well. Esther 9:1 says it all. On the 13th day, 12th month of Adar, edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them. But now, I love the phrase here, the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. This is the NIV translation there. So, the tables were turned, the Jews got the upper hand, those who hated them. So now it's the end of fear and pain and time to celebrate. The end of fear and pain. Time to celebrate, at least for them as a nation, as a group of people. And so, when we think about current circumstances, jumping into the present for a second to explain something that is a problem from time to time in God's family, here are some things that come up. Most Christians seem to handle pain better than pleasure. Most Christians seem to handle pain better than pleasure. We kind of expect stress, right? We are, when we're stressed about something, like when there are times where there's nothing for us to be stressed about, we're anxious about the fact we're not stressed. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's like I feel anxious, and I got to figure out what that anxiety is moving towards. So we're kind of uncomfortable with times of comfort, oftentimes, and so when you have times of relief or times of reward that come, we don't know how to handle it sometimes. It doesn't seem natural to us, and so we're just waiting for the other shoe to fall. And so it's good for us to look and see how these folks enjoyed actually a blessing, a time of rest and comfort. This is the reason why we do this. We handle pain better than pleasure is because we have a bad news mentality. That's another blank. Bad news mentality sometimes lurks in our minds. Murphy's Law, someone were to ask you, what do you want first, good news or bad news? Go for the bad news first, right? Get it over with, because you know it's there. So like if somebody were to come to you and say, hey, I want to talk to you about something that's been on my mind. You got a minute? Your reaction to that probably is the same as mine oftentimes, which is like, this is not going to be good. This isn't a good way to enter into a conversation. Something's been on my mind for a while. Do you have a minute? You go in to the office or whatever, and you're talking to the person, and they say, I just want you to know that I love you so much, been praying for you. And stuff. It's like, whoa, you're taken back by that because you're fully expecting a totally different type of conversation. This is the mentality that we have, right? We're always looking for, scared of the bad news or the bad, difficult conversation that's there. And so it is as if we resist and run from the positive. when God has positive things for us to see and to notice. Why do we do this? Maybe it's because we're way more riveted to the past than focused on our future. Think about that. We're riveted to the past than we are focused on the future. In other words, like when we think back to times gone by, oftentimes we remember the bad parts of our past. And those negative things that have happened, we relate to our present circumstance or what may be coming up in the future. And so if you have that kind of a negative perspective or haven't had enough negative experiences in your past, it can color your current situation in such a way, or even the way you see your future, that's where the anxiety grows. That's where the bitter root can grow, and you can get yourself spun up in this mentality of doom that really shouldn't exist, because times are different now than they were before. So that's what we're trying to look at here. Why it's important for us to celebrate and to notice the blessings when they come. In Philippians 3:13 and 14, we find 14 words that are the key to celebration. 14 words, key to celebration. Those words are, forgetting what is behind and straining toward what is ahead, I press on. Forgetting what is behind and then straining toward what is ahead, I press on. That's a key to celebration. That's a key to noticing the blessing of the moment. So, we acknowledge the present with celebration. We acknowledge the present with celebration. So looking back on what happened in Esther's story, an important detail that we keep bringing up over and over again, it's important, especially in our conversation today, to do that. It's in Esther 3, verses 6 and 7. This detail cannot be overlooked. It needs to be brought back up again. Verse 6, it says, "Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai." Who's he?
Haman.
Scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. That's Haman. Okay, so Haman's looking into this guy Mordecai. This is the context here. He's looking into this guy Mordecai who's offended him by not bowing. And now as he's finding out more about Mordecai, he's noticing, well, this is one of those Jews. I don't like any of those people. Remember, he was an Agagite, related to the giant who was killed by David. And so there's some animosity there even between these cultures, these nations. And so it continues, verse 6. "Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month of Nisan, the pure, that is, the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and month. And the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar." Okay. So Haman makes these plans to exterminate the Jewish people in all of Persia. But in doing that, he uses this technique of casting lots, which you see in the Bible, in the Old Testament especially. That technique's used even by priests to help with making decisions, like their magic 8-ball, basically. So Haman, in determining the date for his plans, here comes a blank, relied on the casting of lots. The lot was called pure, so P-U-R is how you spell that. The lot was called pure. Or pur, I don't know if it's
No,
a
that's two R's.
cat thing, P-U-R.
That's two R's, perfect.
Purr, it's like 2 R's make, that's what the cat says. Pure. So in the casting of lots, we saw that Haman came upon this specific date, which is the 13th. That's a blank, the 13th of Adar. Of course, they named their months differently than we do. Our months came along a little bit later. Steve will have some trivia on that, I'm sure, on when the Gregorian, I think that's what our calendar system is, was adopted. But it was well after these days. So the Persians had those specific months that were set up, 13th of Adar. In Hebrew, to make something plural, you used I-N. I-N, that's a blank. We're going somewhere here with all this.
Instant message.
What's that?
Instant message. Instant Messenger. And then
I am, that's right, yeah, you use Instant Messenger, I am, to make it work. So like when you see in Scripture the seraphim or the cherubim, what's that reference to? It's a reference to angels, right? These heavenly creatures that were created by God, but they're spoken of in a plurality a lot of times in Revelation. And instead of the translators of Revelation making a new word such as angels or something like that, angels is way too broad a term. It just basically means messenger of God. These were specific creatures that were different from these other specific heavenly creatures. And so the translators were like, we're not even going to try to translate this into ox and donkey or something like that. We're going to basically leave the Hebrew as it is. So those are Hebrew words, seraphim, cherubim, to refer to these heavenly creatures. Well, the I am is making that plural. So when you take pure, which is the name of a lot, and you add an I am, you have Purim. So then that leads us to what the Feast of Purim is, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. So Haman used Purim to find his date in Esther 3:13, the date of exterminating the Jews. All right, so we're still kind of looking at a specific detail that's going to make sense in a little bit. Here's what Esther 3:13 says. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. Now, as we know, the tables were turned. The tables were turned. So what we talked about last time was the very order, the edict that was given to the Persians on how to exterminate the Jews, women and children, and plundering goods, was then given to the Jewish people on how to defend themselves. Remember? So they flipped that same wording and basically said, this is how you're going to defend yourself. You're going to kill those who come after you. You're going to kill the women. You're going to kill the children. And you are going to plunder their goods. Well, the Jews held back from that total response in that way, held back from vengeance, and instead they protected themselves. There's a difference between the two. And so they demonstrated that difference there in the chapters that we saw last time, in chapter 9, or 10. No, it was 9. Yeah. So that was the first half of chapter 9. So now we get into the second half of chapter 9, and we see the result now that the Jews successfully defended themselves as the tables were turned. And here's what happens next, verse 17. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. So in honor of this remarkable day, the Jews created a day of celebration called the Feast of Purim. P-U-R-I-M. It's a big holiday even today for those who are culturally Jewish. Speaking of, there's a difference between being religiously Jewish and culturally Jewish. There are people who are known as Messianic Jewish people who are Christians who still hold to a lot of the old Jewish traditions, not to the point of legalism or trying to replace the New Testament with Jewish tradition, but they actually still keep some of the practices and the feasts and things like that of the Old Testament, which I think is great. And if you've ever had an experience with a Messianic Jewish service, even around like the Seder, which is their Passover time, it's a very meaningful experience, because everything that they refer to in all of these rituals that they have with the feast have everything to do with Jesus. And for a Jew to acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah, they have so much insight because of their background and knowledge of the Jewish people in the Old Testament, that they can tell you a lot more about even Jesus, where his culture, some of the things that he talked about, than your average Protestant preacher coming out of Gentile land like myself. So there's such a significant connection that can be made there when you're in touch with folks who are Messianic Christian or Messianic Jewish people. And so I would encourage you to experience that if you haven't. And so that's Feast of Purim is one of those that they celebrate, still celebrated to this day. And I want you to notice this. When they do these feasts, their past is causing them to celebrate, not mourn. Right? So we talked about individually, we look at our past and we pick up the bad things, and we want to continually remember bad things. That we feel like that protects us from more bad things happening in the present or the future. But instead, the example we get from God's people is when they look back, they're remembering the positive things that resulted, even from the challenges, and that gives them an optimism towards their present and their future. We need this. You've got to be able, in times of struggle or in times of questioning, to look back and say, oh, but God came through and helped me through this circumstance or this circumstance in order to continue to move in the way that God wants you to move towards faithfulness. Okay. There's a town in Alabama. This is a story that was shared in the chapter, I believe. A town in Alabama where the major livelihood was raising cotton. And one year, a bumper crop was coming in, and rodents called boll weevils came in and destroyed the crop, the economy of that small town. Boll weevils. You heard of those? Well, this town knew about them. This is a true story. So instead of sitting back and moving into the poorhouse, one ingenious farmer began to grow peanuts. Well, lo and behold, boll weevils did not like peanuts. And so he produced a completely other bumper crop. And pretty soon, other farmers follow with other types of crops, and the economy was quickly restored in that town. And the town is now called Enterprise, Alabama. And in that town, there can be found a monument to the boll weevil. Which makes perfect sense, right? The boll weevil was the lot that was cast for that town. Make sense? So they're able to take this rodent that's destroyed almost destroyed their economy and celebrate it because it is a picture of the ingenuity, the response, the positivity that came out of them having to deal with the struggle that they found themselves in with this pesky boll weevil. So Enterprise, Alabama. You ever find yourself going through that town or maybe traveling through on Google Maps, you can probably find that boll weevil. I'm sure there's probably pictures of it on Google somewhere. So each of us has lot cast experiences in life. That's a couple of blanks there. Lot cast, L-O-T, and then the second word is C-A-S-T. What I'm referring to is the Haman technique of this is the day you will be destroyed. Lot cast experiences in life. And the real problem comes when we don't recover, when we don't erect monuments and establish Purim or plan to celebrate. I missed a word there, but establish Purim, our plan to celebrate. Yes, ma'am. It's an insect. I was picturing like a little.
It's like a locust?
Oh, it looks like a beetle. Yeah, like a mix between a locust and a beetle.
Oh, wow.
They still have them on this way.
Huh.
Yeah, down North Carolina.
Well, watch out for the boll weevels, and if you got them,
Peanuts.
there are peanuts instead. All right. So if you haven't heard anything else in this lesson, peanuts. That's the key. So,
Organic pesticides.
so we all have those things that we can look back and celebrate, and this means that you don't have to forget the past. That's the blank here. So after lot cast experiences in life, you don't have to forget the past. Just build a monument on it and celebrate it as a learning experience. That's what this is for me. I got this at the ripe old age of 34 years old. You get these things when you're like 18, you don't know any better. I got it when I was 34, and I was in the midst of a bigger crisis than I'm even in now. And it's a reference to the woman who anointed Jesus' feet, Mary. Whether Mary of Bethany or Mary Magdalene, two different occasions. This is specifically about the occasion in John 14, which is Mary of Bethany. I think I referred to it last time I preached a couple weeks ago, about how she broke this expensive jar of perfume and Judas is coming after her about it. You know, that money could have been given to the poor, and just talking about how it seemed like this was a wasted thing to pour out so much of an offering on Jesus' feet, but it absolutely wasn't. And other people may not have been able to see it that way, but she understood it, and Jesus understood it, and he said, what you've done will never be forgotten. For me, the time I got this was a time when I didn't think I'd ever go back to ministry, and I wasn't sure if what I did in ministry even mattered, because I'd gone through such a struggle with my marriage and all that stuff, which I've talked about before. So I needed a reminder that even though I, at the time was selling cars, what I did mattered, and if for nothing else, it mattered because I did it for Jesus, and that was the main thing, right? So here I am back in ministry, and here we are, another season of craziness, and certainly not as crazy as it was back then. And I look at this, and I'm reminded of God's goodness, His faithfulness, and so that's what I'm talking about. You've got to have things like that are reminders for you. In the Old Testament, they called those things, you remember? Ebenezers. Stones of remembrance. Remember, they would go to a place, and this isn't in your notes, but they would go to a place, and like if Jacob wrestled with God, he would stack up some rocks, and he'd make it an altar. And he'd give it a name. This was the place, Bethel, or House of God, or whatever. This is the place where I met with God. And you had several of these wells and altars and things that were named after these encounters that people had with God, or with a struggle that they were able to overcome with God's help. We need those things in our life. We need those types of... So you can purge your shoes, but don't purge those memories, okay? So when you have, I think there's like a Christmas song, Mama Shoes or something like that. Christmas shoes, right? Christmas shoes, I forgot the whole story, but I remember it's a sad one. They take a life of their own, an object takes a life of its own because of the relationship, the significance of it, right? That's what we're after. Okay. So, be encouraged by the in-your-face Haman. Here's our God nature of Esther 9, verses 18 and 19. Esther 9, 18 and 19. Check this out, Haman. The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on the 13th and 14th, and then on the 15th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. And that is why rural Jews, those living in villages, observe the 14th of the month of Adar as a day of joy and feasting, a day of forgiving presents to each other. This would be probably the equivalent to their Thanksgiving. And it all points back to what would have been certain destruction for the Jews had God not intervened in the way that He did. And so, imagine they have their own boll weevil memorial site that they set up, and instead, let's just say maybe it's like a 75-foot pole that Haman hung on the top of this monument, and then on the monument you have these words that are etched on it. These are the last part of chapter 9, just sound like words that you would etch on a stone in some memorial site. So here it is, verse 20. Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. Sounds like Thanksgiving. So the Jews agreed to continue the celebration they had begun, doing what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them and had cast the pure, that is, the lot, for their ruin and destruction. But when the plot came to the king's attention, he issued written orders that the evil scheme Haman had devised against the Jews should come back onto his own head, and that he and his sons should be impaled on poles. Oh boy. So there it is. That's why you have a pole there at the monument. All right? Therefore, these days were called Purim from the word pure, because of everything written in this letter, and because of what they had seen and what had happened to them, the Jews took it on themselves to establish the custom that they and their descendants and all who joined them should without fail observe these 2 days every year in the way prescribed and at the time appointed. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation by every family and in every province and in every city. And these days of Purim should never fail to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of these days die out among their descendants. So, what the tradition is, at least today, I don't know how far back some of these go, but when Purim is celebrated today, Jews come dressed up in costumes to hear the book of Esther read. And everyone cheers at the hero and heroine, and they all boo and hiss and stomp their feet when the name Haman is mentioned. This is not a reenactment of a tragedy, but a celebration of triumph. It's a blank, triumph. Celebration of triumph. Just like we have an Independence Day and we shoot the fireworks off as a reminder of the battle and the declaration of victory during that time. This same type of celebration is given in this way during Purim with the Jewish people. So, what are those memorials and monuments, the physical and mental ones that you have? That's what we need to have, even today. Because our goal is not to live rootless, fast-paced lives, never learning from the past. So when you think of holidays, when you think of, I think a great example of how we memorialize events in our life is by taking the time to journal about those things. I wish I was better at keeping that habit, but I'm thankful for the times that I've done it. And I go in waves of journaling. But those times where either you keep like notes in a prayer book or some type of a journal of what happened during the day, gives you an opportunity to see patterns that God is working in your life, so that when you come into new things that happen in your life, you can look back to those days. And I still have a journal of those days when I was really struggling, out of ministry and all that stuff, like I mentioned. And I can go back to those today and read the words and thoughts that I was thinking. And they were a great encouragement to me. Because it was then that I learned for myself that my faith was my own. It wasn't my career. It wasn't my momentum and projection, it was my destiny to do church work. No, it was something that I desired to be in church, to be a part of it, even in a time when it didn't matter if I was there or not, to other people at least. So that was an important time for me. So journaling is a helpful thing. Memorializing in one way or another is a helpful thing. This is what communion is for us every week. It is taking an object as a memorial, a very simple object, and memorializing something profound for us that we have to continually be reminded and reflecting on, and that is the gospel. So challenge yourself to think of a boll weevil moment in your past. Right? And when you think of those boll weevil moments, those lots that have been cast in your past, ask yourself, what did you learn from it? That's a good exercise when you're journaling. Even if it's not something you're going through presently, but there are some memories that you carry with you. Maybe still dream about them because they affect you mentally or emotionally. So a way of getting that out is actually writing about it and then asking the question, what's the lesson from this that I can learn? Where's the victory that I can celebrate from this thing? And so that's a good practice spiritually. So this is a book about Esther, but she was not the main character of the story. In fact, Esther, the name, wasn't even mentioned until chapter 2. And it's not even mentioned at all in chapter 10. So that's where we get to chapter 10, Esther, as we finish things up. Verse 1, King Xerxes imposed tribute throughout the empire to its distant shores, and all his acts of power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king had promoted, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia? Mordecai, the Jew, was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. That's the chapter. So Esther's power came from her responses as well as her restraints. Her responses as well as her restraints. You can think back on how she approached the king, the wisdom that she had in responding to the king's request, but also her restraint in making sure she waited until the precise time that seemed appropriate for her to bring up her concern. So her power came from her responses and her restraints, her dignity from her integrity as well as her humility, Though she doesn't fill every scene, the effect of her presence absolutely does fill every moment in Esther. But even more so, you see God's presence in every scene as well. Which, by the way, God's name is never mentioned in Esther. But in the end, we know God was on every page, and in the end, God wins. So here are 3 principles to remember into our present and future. When God wins, the people he uses are often unexpected. The people he uses are often unexpected. This example that I shared of a person contributing, a couple contributing the amount of money that they did this past week, not the kind of people that you would have expected doing that. That's the kind of thing that you'll see. God shows up in unexpected ways through unexpected people. Psalm 78, verse 70, he chose David, his servant, and took him from the sheep pens. From tending the sheep, he brought him to be the shepherd of his people Jacob, of Israel his inheritance. And David shepherded them with integrity of heart, skillful hands, he led them. There's an example, someone coming out of nowhere, being used by God to do incredible stuff that we talked about recently as we went through the lessons of David's life. And then I put Moses in your notes, and without any kind of elaboration, I'll just say Moses. Okay? There's someone else you can think of. Okay, well, yeah, this guy was out in the wilderness for a while, just tending sheep. Then you have the harlot, the prostitute, who hid the spies in a crucial time. Who was that? It's Rahab.
And she was also mentioned in the lineage of Jesus.
Yeah, she's listed in the genealogy of Jesus, I think in the book of Matthew, as one of very few women. In that time, you didn't list women in genealogies, typically, but Matthew mentioned her and some others as well along the way to give her honor. Then you have that defecting, rebellious prophet who headed up the evangelistic Nineveh crusade. That's Jonah. Defecting, in other words, running. Jonah was the one who was the least willing to do what God wanted him to do, literally running from God as quickly as he can, swimming from God if he had to, and of course getting kind of drug into this calling that he was in with the crusade of Nineveh, a town of people that were very far from God, but turned to God quickly. So that's Jonah. A Christian-hating Pharisee who actually wrote most of the New Testament. That's Paul. He was spending time devising ways to destroy Christians until Jesus got a hold of him. The least likely one to actually minister to the Gentiles, a Pharisee of Pharisees. Why would a Pharisee want to have anything to do with Gentiles, much less see that they come to know God? Paul. That's the one that God chose to do that. So this should probably be a little humbling to us. Think about it. If God's using you to do something in ministry for Him, or to work in some way in His church, it's probably because you're the least likely to deserve to do it. Think about it. I oftentimes think to myself, especially this past year, it's been a crazy year. But I've mentioned about going home to see, home, well, not really home, but where I was born, Louisiana, to see the other side of my family. And I think about how God kind of called me out of a weird family situation into where I am now. And God used my parents that I love deeply. They're believing people. My dad was a deacon at Northampton church where I grew up for a number of years, and humble, faithful guy. And so I follow his example in many ways. So I'm grateful for where I've come from, but you wouldn't have picked me out of a crowd, especially if you knew me as a teenager like Steve did. I was not a sociable person. I'm still not a sociable person, but I was even less so at that time in my life. But I think about that and I think, man, how good God is to use folks like us. So let that humble us as we go. Steve.
I'd like to correct that. He was very sociable with the teenage girls in my youth.
That's true.
all I'm gonna say.
That's true. Yeah, that's how I actually met Steve. I kept visiting his church in Richmond, though I lived in Newport News, because there were girls in his church. And I use the plural for that too. Sad. Moving on, number 2, when God wins, the qualities he upholds are usually unpretentious. The qualities that God upholds are usually unpretentious when he wins. God upholds humble people, like Esther. That's a blank. Humble. He uses humble people. The way the world works today is the way it's kind of always worked. The people who are alpha and the most, like, out there driving force, making things happen, a lot of times, they can make a difference. And there's definitely leaders in the church that are like that, that God is using in great ways. But more times than not, God uses the least, the lowly, the humble. There's something about that somewhere. I think it's in the Bible. So, God used humble people in Esther. Humility is not how you dress or even act. It is an attitude. So, Philippians 2 talks about this humility that God is after. It says in verse 3, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interest of the others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant. Being made in human likeness and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. We're running out of time, but I wanted to read this really quick little anecdote that Swindoll shares in his chapter on this about a guy named Walter. Walter went to work for the largest corporation in the world. Personnel director told Walter he must start at the bottom and work his way up, so he began to work in the mailroom. Walter liked his job, but often daydreamed about what it would be like to be an executive, the president, maybe even chairman of the board. One day, as Walter was dividing the mail, he saw a cockroach in the corner of the room. Now, he walked over to step on it. Walter heard a tiny voice crying out, "Don't kill me! I'm Milton the cockroach, and if you spare me, I'll grant you all your wishes." So, Walter agreed that was a good arrangement, and he spared Milton's life, the wish-granting cockroach. You didn't know that existed? We learned about boll weevils and cockroaches today. So here's Walter's first wish, to leave the mailroom and become a vice president. So Milton granted him the wish. In fact, Milton granted wish after wish until finally Walter was the chairman of the board of the largest corporation in the whole world, with an office to the top floor of the tallest building in the whole world. Everyone looked up to Walter, and he was very happy. Walter often said to himself, "I'm Walter, and I'm at the top. No one is bigger or more important than me." Then one day, Walter heard footsteps on the roof, and he went out to find a small boy on his knees praying. "Are you praying to Walter?" he asked. After all, he was the chairman of the board of the largest corporation in the world. And the boy replied, "Oh, no, I'm praying to God." Walter was quite disturbed by this turn of events, so he returned to his office and sent for Milton the cockroach. "I have another wish," he told Milton. "I want to be like God." And so Milton granted Walter's wish. The next day, Walter was back in the mailroom. That's what it's like to be like God. Find yourself back in the mailroom. Because that's what Jesus did, right? He took on the nature of a servant. Number 3, when God wins, the message he honors is usually universal. The message he honors is usually universal. So Mordecai spoke peace to the entire country. It wasn't just to the Jewish people, it was also to the Persians as well. So, of course, you had the Persians who were out to kill the Jews, specifically Haman's family, that were eliminated. And that was to protect life. But the rest of the Persians weren't eliminated. The women and children, even though they were allowed to do that, they were not eliminated in that way. And so peace was brought not just to the Jewish people, but to the entire country. God's plan is for everyone. It is not to be kept to ourselves. As the Great Commission tells us, that we are to go into all nations. Yeah, all nations, making disciples, baptizing, and teaching them to obey all that I've commanded. with you to the very end of the age. So God was full of surprises in Esther, but he is not done yet. The best is yet to come, and each of us are here for such a time as this. The end. Or is it? Well, I hope you had fun with this one. I certainly did, and of course timing is very precise on what we're talking about here. With stuff that's happening in my life in particular, and probably in a number of y'all's lives as well. It's neat how God works that way.